Hello, guys. This is Mr. Cole going over our next set of videos and stuff to learn about. It looks like the first week went well for most folks, so I hope everybody's doing all right, and we're gonna keep on keeping on. We are gonna be moving once you finish your test on civil rights to chapter 22 in the book, which is the Vietnam War. I highly advise kind of looking at the book along with the notes on this because the Vietnam War is very, very complex. I will do the best I can on a video lecture to share it with you, but you might have to do some outside research of your own. With that today, seventh period is my class to pick on. So before we even start, Owen, you know the deal. Talking timeout through the entire video. And no yelling about Eminem. All right, so here we go with that. We're going to be talking about the Vietnam War today, probably the most divisive war in our nation's history, and incredibly complex war that even still today is kind of tough to grapple with what happened in Vietnam. Today might take us a little bit longer because we're going to look at how we ended up with the Vietnam War in the first place. So we're going to talk about how we move towards that conflict. So this is section 1 of the book on that. Now, just to give you an idea of where we are at in the world. So here's a map of Asia. And with this, Vietnam is this skinny country right here, okay, in a part of the world that is known as Indochina. So this right here is this area of the world is called Indochina. This little peninsula that kind of shoots off of China right there. And Vietnam is the skinny country that kind of borders the coast of that peninsula. Couple reminders at the time here. Remember, China is a communist country. Okay, here's Korea. So North Korea is a communist country. Russia, of course, is a communist country as well. Okay. Now, at the time, just to give you kind of a more zoomed-in map here of Indochina. So Indochina is made up of 3 countries. It is made up of Vietnam, okay, Laos right here, and Cambodia. Okay, so those are the 3 countries. The primary fighting will be in Vietnam. However, you will see that Laos and Cambodia will also have an involvement in the Vietnam War. Okay, so we are actually going to rewind all the way till 1941 because for us, the Vietnam War was a war fought in the 1960s. For the people of Vietnam, the Vietnam War had started way earlier, all the way into the 1940s. So Vietnam, as well as Laos and Cambodia, were controlled by the French. The French had set up a colony in Vietnam called French Indochina. And they had this colony all the way since like the 1880s, 1890s during the age of imperialism, which if you guys don't know what imperialism means right now, you're going to drive me crazy. But with this, during the age of imperialism, as all these nations were taking over colonies, France takes over Indochina and takes over control of Vietnam. Now, the French, as with most cases with colonizers, had a very, very brutal rule, very oppressive government that they set up. Essentially a dictatorship. The people had hardly any rights. Lots of inequality that took place there. Okay. Now, with the start of World War II, this is going to change. So if you remember, Japan had spread out and taken over Korea, had taken over parts of China, and they also expanded and took over French Indochina, and they kicked the French out. Okay, so Japan comes in during World War II, and they rule Vietnam. Okay, well, with this, as the French leave and retreat from Vietnam, and Japan has rule, a leader by the name of Ho Chi Minh, okay, who was a communist, is going to form an organization called the Viet Minh. The Viet Minh is the army of Ho Chi Minh, okay? It is the communist army who basically carried on the fight against Japan in Vietnam. So the French leave, and Ho Chi Minh leads the resistance in Vietnam, trying to drive the Japanese out. And he's really successful at it. Obviously, the war ends with the United States dropping the atomic bomb on Japan. However, Ho Chi Minh really caused a lot of problems for the Japanese and showed very, very, very tough resistance, basically without hardly any American support at all. Now, with this, Ho Chi Minh Here's Ho Chi Minh, by the way. Okay. Ho Chi Minh actually had grown up in the West. He had grown up in France. He actually spent some time in the United States and Great Britain. So he was very well traveled. And as a result, he expected that all of these Western nations that he had lived in, who believed in freedom and democracy, that after the war they would allow the Vietnamese people to be free, to have their own freedom, to have their own democracy. Well, of course, we know that is not going to happen. After the war, as soon as Japan is defeated, France just comes rolling right back into Vietnam like nothing ever happened. They come back in, oh, hey, we're back home. Thanks, guys. And for Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese people, they see this once again as just a continuation of World War II, that Japan had invaded and now France was invading once again. So Ho Chi Minh is going to lead a resistance. He is going to, instead of fighting against Japan, now begin the fight against France. Okay, so if you really had to take a year as to when the Vietnam War really started, for the people of Vietnam, it started in 1945 with Ho Chi Minh battling the French. Okay, now with this, the United States had surprisingly, but you think by the 1950s, America was kind of done with the whole idea of colonizing. We had already given back the Philippines. We had given many of these countries kind of their independence, right? So, we weren't super supportive of colonies. However, we remember we're in the middle of the Cold War. And the big problem with the Cold War is that idea of containment, trying to contain the spread of communism in just Eastern Europe. Well, with this, the fact that Ho Chi Minh was a communist really, really scared the United States. So the United States is actually going to support France in their colonization of Indochina, Vietnam. Now, the reason that we did this is because there was this theory that if we let one single country in Asia fall to communism, then all of the countries would begin to fall. This was called the domino theory. It was the idea that if we allowed Vietnam to fall to communism, then it would spread to Laos and Cambodia and Thailand, and then to eventually very important countries to the United States like India or Bangladesh. Okay? So we kind of, support the French and doing some really bad things to the Vietnamese people because, hey, guess what? The French aren't communists. Okay? Here's the problem. The French are not well run. They are not well managed. And the French are actually defeated at an enormous battle called the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Okay, Dien Bien Phu is right up here. Okay, so the French were surrounded on all sides, and Ho Chi Minh's army, the Viet Minh, is going to win. I have a picture here of them flying the communist star and the communist flag over one of the trenches at Dien Bien Phu. So the French lost. Okay, so the world has to decide kind of what to do with Vietnam. So they all meet in Geneva, which is in Switzerland, in 1954. Ho Chi Minh and the French come to decide about the peace agreement, okay? And the world comes up with this, and you're probably going to roll your eyes when you hear this. They decide to make a communist country in the north, led by Ho Chi Minh, and what was called a nationalist government in the south, a non-communist government in the south. Now, you've probably heard this before. If you remember, we also divided Germany up, and we also divided Korea up. So they figured, hey, it works so well there, let's just do it in Vietnam. And as you can imagine, this is not going to go very well. So obviously, America now becomes kind of the leading supporter of the South Vietnamese government. So you can see the divide here. So here is South Vietnam. This is the nationalist side. These are the non-communists. Okay. Up here is the North Vietnamese. This is the communist part of Vietnam controlled by Ho Chi Minh. Okay. Now, I use the word nationalist and not the word democracy, because the reality is America did not allow a democracy in South Vietnam. We set up our own president there by the name of Diem. Diem was a South Vietnamese person who had studied and spent time and had very, very close relationship with the United States. So we install him as their president. Now, here's the thing. Diem, not exactly a nice guy. He is going to completely end all elections in South Vietnam and is going to name himself essentially the dictator of South Vietnam. Now, he is going to run an incredibly corrupt government, a government that is only worried about him keeping power and not necessarily doing what's best with the people. The other problem is that Diem is a Catholic, and Diem is a Catholic of a country that's about 90% Buddhist. Okay? Well, as part of Diem's corrupt policies, in order to keep himself in power, he strips all voting rights away from the Buddhist population of South Vietnam. So any Buddhists had their rights essentially taken away by Diem. And the country begins to unravel. There's a protest in the streets against Diem's government, including, and this is kind of a gross picture, but I want to show you to, including a very famous protest of Buddhist monks dousing themselves in gasoline and lighting themselves on fire as a form of nonviolent protest, committing suicide, to show the struggle that they are living in under Diem's government. Okay, so I know it's a pretty graphic picture, one of the really famous images from South Vietnam. So with this, Diem is shown to be a really, really bad leader, right? And he is obviously not doing what's best for the people. So the North Vietnamese see an opportunity. Ho Chi Minh begins a war against South Vietnam to try to take over South Vietnam for the North and turn the South communist. Now, they are going to have battles, and this is where it gets a little complex. They're going to be having battles, South Vietnam versus North Vietnam, up here around the border. However, Ho Chi Minh is going to set up a secret guerrilla army called the Viet Cong. Now, when I use the word guerrilla, it is Guerrilla. Guerrilla warrior is hit-and-run tactics, kind of hidden, not dressed in normal uniforms. Okay, ambush-style tactics. The Viet Cong, okay, were communists who were fighting in the jungles and in the villages of South Vietnam. So while the battle is happening up here, the Viet Cong are leading ambushes all throughout South Vietnam. And you have no idea who they are, okay, because they just dress like normal folks. Now, the Viet Cong was supplied by a network of roads called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Ho Chi Minh Trail ran through Laos, and they were able to supply, and through Cambodia as well, and they were able to supply guns and bullets and ammunition almost right into the middle of South Vietnam. So South Vietnam has two wars to fight. They got to fight the North Vietnamese army up here, but also fight the Viet Cong soldiers in the south. Okay? Now, as is obvious that Diem is doing a really bad job as president, as things are growing worse and worse and worse and worse and worse in South Vietnam, the United States and President Kennedy decides to make a decision, okay? And that is to overthrow Diem, to replace Diem with a new president of South Vietnam. So we give our approval. There's what's called a coup, where the army overthrows the president. The South Vietnamese army kills Diem, and we are in an absolute mess in South Vietnam. Now, tomorrow, what you're going to get is more of what the United States is doing. Because as you can imagine, we are not just sitting on the sidelines, okay? We are very actively involved in this, and you'll get that a little bit more tomorrow. So I know today was pretty complex. The big takeaways, okay, was that one, Vietnam was originally controlled by the French. After the French lose, it was set into North and South Vietnam. And then I really want you to understand that idea of the Viet Cong and how the Viet Cong are leading ambushes all throughout South Vietnam while the war is going on up here. Okay? So tomorrow we'll learn about what America is doing during this whole thing. Thanks, guys. Have a good one. Oh, I almost forgot. Make sure everyone says hi to Decker. Make sure he's not too grumpy today. See you guys.